Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Executive Leadership Series. In expanding roles in complex environments, one of the most common leadership experiences is this: what worked before doesn't consistently work now. The external work may look similar, but internally something's changed. The stakes are higher, time is compressed, and decisions carry more weight. What many leaders notice is not a lack of knowledge, but a lack of access to what they already know. You can have the experience, the judgment, and the capability, and still find that in certain moments you perform at the level in certain moments you don't perform at the level you expect. Then in other moments everything flows. You're clear, decisive, and effective. The question is, what's driving that difference? Today I'm going to give you a simple model, the 5 levels of personal leadership, that explains why performance changes under pressure. It will show you how the same person can move from clarity to confusion and back again, often in minutes, but more importantly, how this pattern can shape an entire lifetime, because the time that you spend in one level is less time spent in a different level. And more importantly, it will frame performance not as a fixed trait, but as a dynamic state that can be recognized and influenced, that you can control. Once you see it, you won't unsee it. And it changes how you think about performance entirely. As I go through the content today, there are 3 things I'd like you to keep in mind. 1, performance is state dependent. The issue is not what you know, it's what you can access in the moment. Your capability doesn't disappear under pressure, but your access to it can. 2, movement is fast, but where you stay and return, that becomes habitual. You can shift between levels in seconds, but repeated time in a level becomes your default. What starts as a moment becomes a pattern. What becomes a pattern becomes your style, your personality, your identity, those constructs. What feels like personality, this is 3. What feels like personality is often conditioning. These levels are not fixed traits. They're reinforced patterns, and where you spend the most time is where you begin to identify as that's who you are. But personality is a construct, as I alluded to, and that construct consists of many elements. The 5 levels is one of those very important elements. So let's take a look at what I mean when we talk about these 5 levels. If you think about the level where we probably spend, for most of us, we spend most of our time, and we'll call this stabilized. Now this is, as I said, where we probably spend most of our time, certainly in normal times, but in times of stress, you may find yourself in a different level. That level may be something more like destabilized. And then in good times, you may find yourself in agency. Now what's interesting is it's easy to begin thinking that these different levels are something that's out of our control. Like I said, it's our personality, our identity. It's just who we are. But the reality is, what level you find yourself in was actually set up prior to that, before that. You may have heard me talk about, in some of my other talks, I talk about moving upstream. And when you move upstream, you can move upstream, by the way, temporarily in terms of time. So moving into this network of neurons where things happen a lot faster. And you can also move upstream in terms of orientation. As a leader, you're shaping how people think about things. You're priming. You're using vision and mission conversation to help shape, and that will have an impact on how people view whatever is coming next. So moving upstream is how you get control over these areas. I agree. If you wait until you're in that space, now you can still change it, but it's a lot harder. There's a diagram that I used not too long ago in one of the talks. And if you think about a curve, this is early and this is late. And in this case, late is measured in seconds and minutes. If you look at effort, the amount of effort that's required, if you can catch the shift and adjust trajectory, the amount of effort to shift that trajectory is low. It's very low. And it rises with time. And the impact of that effort is very high. So it's an exponential difference between catching it early and catching it late. You have a much greater impact and it takes much less effort. So who wouldn't want to sign up for that? As it ages, the effort goes up and it spikes. And then your effort is higher and the positive impact from that effort is lower. So obviously, it's better to be on this side. We want to make changes up here. So this is upstream. It's upstream in terms of time, but you can also think in terms of upstream as orientation. It's always nice, and if you, just a very simple thing. If you're receiving driving directions to get somewhere, someone's giving you driving directions, the way Google Maps works, it tells you what's coming. It tells you, get into the left lane, get into the right lane, in a quarter of a mile, make a right turn, whatever it is. It's giving you information upstream. And that's both in time, but also orientation, because it's giving you a sense of where you are relative to when the shift happens. And the same thing can happen by speaking in terms of strategy, speaking in terms of vision and mission. So that's the point there. Now, when we're in stabilized mode, some things we want to think about. We have coherence. Presence. I'll say present, and mindfulness. Now, what happens when we drop down into destabilized? Well, as you drop down into destabilized, it's a reaction to something that happened upstream. Remember, where we find ourselves, it actually started upstream. And that upstream could be time pressure, urgency, ambiguity, and you don't have to take my word for it. Just think about your own experience. As you step into situations and you're not sure what's going on, maybe it's a little bit ambiguous, you're not sure, that can start taking up attention units. This is what anything that's taking up attention units has the impact, has the potential to cause you to drop down a level. If it's not only taking up attention units, but it appears to be a threat, that's even greater, and it can accelerate the shift downward. Now, the next one down is collapsed. Once you collapse, the big problem is that you start reacting to your own reactions. This is what I mean when I say you have to get out of your head. When a person is in their head, they're literally reacting to their own reactions. If you think about a stimulus reaction response cycle, I know they call it stimulus response, but it's actually stimulus reaction response. And that stimulus to reaction is conditioned. That's happening on the subconscious side, the network of neurons. It happens very fast, processing at 1 million bits, 11 million bits per second. If there's one stimulus that happens, let's say that they come in and they said they're going to be announcing changes in the organization in 2 weeks. That's just information. But let's say you perceive it to be that there might be rifts or layoffs. And if there's layoffs, then you might be affected. And if you're affected, it might happen immediately. So those are three different things that we don't even know if it's happening because you're not even sure what it's going to be about, and or will it affect you, and what's the timeline. So one stimulus already has two or three potential stimuli attached to it. Then what happens is you start thinking about it and ruminating about it. And the next thing you know, you're thinking about, well, where am I going to go? Suppose I get laid off. Am I going to get another job? What's going to happen? Am I going to get severance? And now you have all these other questions. And because you're threatened, the subconscious tends to look at the worst case scenario for each one of these. So now you have stacked. You have 6 or 7 items stacked that are all negative, and the likelihood of them happening all together is very, very low. But you're reacting to them as though they not only can happen altogether, but that they will happen. So you've shifted from this possibility thing, again, ambiguity, right? You don't know, to that this is going to happen and it's going to be bad and it's going to affect me and it's the worst case scenario. So this is where the person collapses. And once they collapse, it's very difficult to get them back because it's almost like a phobia response. If you ever watch somebody who's having a phobia episode, they don't respond to anything rational. As a matter of fact, if in certain situations, if you're trying to tell the person it's okay, it's only a plastic snake, you actually become the threat too, because you are fighting against a life or death reaction that they're having, an internal reaction. And anything that's moving them toward it is perceived as an equal threat, and you become just as dangerous. This is why it's very difficult for some people to cure or resolve phobias. And the solution is you just have to dissociate enough so that you are able to intellectualize about it and get out of this network of neurons. It's beyond the scope of this, but the point is you are separating the upstream and the present. So you move these things out. You move the subconscious out of play, so that you can have an intellectual conversation about it. And then collapse, just continuing the list, of course, overload. And you probably are aware, decision fatigue is a thing. And so decision fatigue also impacts willpower. Willpower wanes throughout the day anyway. Your decision-making ability wanes throughout the day. And the more you use it, the more it wanes. And the more stress you're under, the more it wanes. So you have these things that are going on, and they're happening upstream, and they stack, and they tend to cause the destabilize. Now, when I talk about the 7-step reset, I mentioned how we make over tens of thousands of stimulus reaction response cycles a day. And any one of them could be a trigger to start you in that direction. But if you don't recover rapidly, it's easy to stack. And then you have another bad one. And then you're already primed to think that the other shoe is going to drop and there's more negative coming. You're already primed. So now the next stimulus that could have been neutral is all of a sudden charged. And next thing you know, you're scaling. I like to use the example. There are enough YouTube videos around the Karen, person like freaking out over somebody breaking a rule, or sometimes you see it with police officers who are threatened, or maybe it's the person that they stopped on the other side of the traffic stop that feels threatened, and you can see them escalating, and then there's no rational conversation anymore. It's reacting to the inside reaction, and the police officer saying, stop resisting, and the other person is saying, I'm not resisting, and you can see every muscle in their body's tensed up, but they're saying, I'm not resisting. Neither one of them are in reality. They're both inside their head reacting, because that's what happens under stress. Our options narrow, our focus gets very narrow, because it's about fight or flight, and it's designed for a tiger. Remember, our neuroscience, if you will, is based on mostly on our hunter-gatherer time, and that is tens of thousands of years ago. So we've only been living in this kind of an environment with machines and computers and cars and things like that, and assembly lines, and for the last few hundred years. But the neuroscience is still based on that old pattern. So this is why this topic is important to understand this, because once you understand it, you don't have to live with it. This was designed to keep you alive, but it's outdated. So the reason I call it a 7-step reset is because we reset it so that it now supports us instead of apparently seems to work against us. And then the top one we have is expansion. So expansion is where you can move above the line, grow, expand, and you're dealing with what I call the field of infinite possibility, which is very difficult if you're easily triggered. It's also very difficult to be in expansion if you have a lot of either wealth wounds or relationship wounds that can be triggered. I use the example of, somebody's walking along a path and they break up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and while they're walking down the path, there's a bunch of sunflowers over to the side. And there's this intense conversation and this anger and this emotion, and they're seeing the sunflower seeds, and then they're seeing their partner's face, and they're mad and they're upset, and they're going through, again, they're in their head, they're collapsing. And they're looking at the sunflower seeds, and they're collapsing. Flowers, and they're collapsing, and they're looking at the sunflowers. And then that passes. Months or years later, they're on a path, a similar path, not the same one, a similar path with somebody who they care about, and they see those sunflowers, and all of a sudden they go into this mode again where they're feeling threatened and they're feeling insecure, and they think that person's going to leave them, and they get into an argument about something that doesn't even exist because they destabilized and then collapsed into here and is just off of an anchor. Now that's a different conversation than the levels. Obviously it applies and you can see how it works. But the point is, that's why I say agency and expansion is difficult if you have wealth wounds, if you have relationship wounds, if you have these fears and inhibitions that can be triggered by a push of a button, and we know there are people out there who love to push buttons, and if you have buttons, they're going to get pushed. And the other thing, if you've done much on social media, there's haters. And it's interesting because I think sometimes, a lot of times, haters are haters not because they hate you, but because they hate the way they feel when they see what you're doing. They're moving along fine, then all of a sudden they see you doing something that they believe is impossible to do. It can't be done. They've got stories around why it can't be done, and then you're doing it, and boom, they collapse here too. So obviously they're not going to get mad at themselves. They get mad at you, and then hence that behavior, the hater behavior. Now, what about up here? So moving up here, what we want to do is get into a lower brainwave. You may have heard that under stress, the beta brain waves, and then in meditation, your alpha brain waves. So you're slowing it down. This is when people talk about the vibration. You don't have to get into mystical mumbo jumbo. Everything I talk about can be backed up and explained in a scientific way, so you don't have to make assumptions. Once you start making assumptions about how we operate, how the neuroscience works, you're introducing opportunity for less agency, because how can you have agency when you have all these assumptions and you can't control them? That's why I don't get into what's happening in the prefrontal cortex, other than the little parts that I have to explain the difference between before you had one and after you had one, because that's a fifth of your brain, essentially 20 billion neurons out of the 100 billion. But it doesn't matter if it's happening in the amygdala and the hippocampus. Not to you, not if you're looking at having more agency and expansion, because they're all neurons. They have a different purpose, but they respond to development the same way. And that's why I don't use vibration and energy, and it's definitely, you're not going to hear me talk about parallel universes and all that stuff, because it's too many assumptions. How do you have agency in that kind of an environment? But everyone can experience moving from stabilized down to destabilized, and they can also remember getting good news and moving up to agency. You may also recall having a few good days in a row and you're feeling like this is possible, but then you get this doubt, right? You get a doubt. When's the other shoe going to drop? Oh boy, here we go again. Things are going too well. You even speak yourself into it. Things are going so well. This is how the language does apply. This is how visualization does apply to this, because visualization can be negative. You can be worrying, and if you're worrying, you're actually picturing and visualizing what you don't want. And by visualizing what you don't want, you're creating what amounts to negative goal setting. So the thing we want up here is being able to control these things. You don't have to respond to everything as though it's urgent. You don't have to accept time pressure. Just because you get a question doesn't mean you have to have the answer right away. You can always ask, well, what's the timeline on that? What's the outside time that this can come back? If you have ambiguity, instead of dealing with trying to get that, you just make a default. Yeah, I get it, but the more likely scenario is this, so why don't we just call it that as the default? Let's plan around that. If it changes, it changes. This is what you'll see high performers doing. Now, whether they know this and explain it this way, who knows? But what they've learned over time is that this is what works. By being able to frame things in such a way that you're not running into time pressure, you're not running into urgency unnecessarily or ambiguity, you're not doing the internal looping, which is what's happening here, by the way. So down here, we start getting internal looping, as I mentioned. And once you're internal looping, it's bad because instead of having a stimulus reaction response every other second, you're having 5 and 6 stimulus reaction, and it's the reaction to reaction to reaction inside of a second. And this is why you can just spiral up. You also get binary thinking, either or, and it's so easy to have it be negative. And then the compounding of mistakes. Now, this is an interesting one too, because project work, all things being equal, project work is harder than operational work. And one of the reasons it's harder is you're going to make more mistakes. In operational work, there's infrastructure, there's patterns, there's habitual support there that keeps you between these parameters. When you get into project work, you're operating in the infinite field, the field of infinite possibilities, and so many different things can go wrong, and you don't have the habit patterns. And probably, in many cases, you have habits that don't serve the project, which means your habit patterns are working against you. And that's where you start compounding mistakes. And next thing you know, the person is getting overwhelmed, and now you're overloaded, and your reputation is at risk, and that impacts your identity, and on and on and on. So that's the backdrop of the 5 levels. I spent more time talking about this because I want it to be relatable. We'll get into this, and then there's strategies. There are things you can do on purpose to move this trajectory upward. So let's move to the slides and then start getting into what that looks like. All right, so the 5 levels of personal leadership, why performance changes under pressure. Everything I talk about is with respect to leadership, whether it's personal leadership or leading others. This aligned with emotional intelligence, because emotional intelligence, the research that went into that was based on neuroscience. The neuroscience doesn't really change. It's just that we know so much more today than we did 30 years ago when emotional intelligence was developed. We didn't have the access to the brain scanning tools that we do today. As a result, much of the emotional intelligence work was based on the fact that people don't change, that the personality is fixed, identity is fixed, intelligence is fixed. But we know now that with neuroplasticity, there are ways that we can do it. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why the 5 levels is so important, because neuroplasticity is definitely not working as well as it could when you're in destabilized or collapsed. Neuroplasticity thrives, as does growth mindset, when you're moving above the stabilized. And we want to spend more time in agency and expansion because we want that to be the habit. We don't want destabilized and collapse to be the default or the habit. It's also aligned with our self-determination theory. Self-determination theory, the 3 pillars, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, are the drivers of intrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is not just motivation, it's actually the people enjoy what they're doing. Now you're going to say, how does it get to be the people like working? Well, it's because you connect the dots from a neuroscience standpoint. Dopamine, serotonin. Serotonin is the feel-good neurotransmitter. Dopamine is a signal amplifier and the reward mechanism to set up habit patterns. And by connecting the dots with language, that's what we use as leaders. We have language and words. We connect the dots so that their needs are being met by doing the work, by doing the tasks. And that's another conversation. I talk about it in my red, white, and blue language. You can find that in my library. Then the next one is, this is an important one. This is the 7-step reset. Now, we're mostly talking about here in this step 3, but if this is happening 30,000 times a day, the important thing is getting back to this state of mindfulness and coherence instantly, because you have about 2 seconds. So we've got to get that rapid recovery happening in milliseconds, not minutes, hours, and days. And that's what step 4 through 7 is about. 4, 5, and 6 is your response, action, and emotional modulation. And then 7 is mindfulness. And by the way, we make all of this habitual through the exercises. The one thing you can't make, you don't know what stimulus is coming, but you can program in how you respond, how you react, and how you respond. So this over here is the network of neurons. This is the subconscious. This is the 600 milliseconds, the 11 million bits per second processing speed. This is what I mean when I say move upstream. You move it upstream. The reason why it's so easy, so less effort, and why it has such a high impact is because we have 11 million bits per second processing speed. So the earlier you catch it, the better off you are. The longer you wait, the more the trajectory is already locked in and the harder it's going to be. It's just a simple example. And then this network of neurons passes off to the conscious mind, something that can be perceived as thought. So the conscious mind can't read what's going through the network of neurons. What's interesting, our higher self, that's why the 7 performance series, mental, physical, spiritual, has the spiritual, which is the higher self, and that's the awareness of awareness. You can become aware of these sensations, and that's how we move upstream. You will learn what sensations mean and feel like. And once you can recognize them for yourself as a leader, you can start recognizing them for your team as well. And so when you see somebody rising up inside, their breath changes and their neck tightens, they either contract or they move into a ready posture. Those are signals that something shifted. Now, you don't know what shifted. I think this whole reading body language is overrated. But what you can follow is that there was a shift, and then we condition in for the leader. What was the shift? What caused the shift? What's coming up for you? You ask the person, what's coming up for you? Or, hey, let's just pause right now. Let's just take a pause and let's get some feedback to see how this is landing. It's going to give people a chance to talk. And by doing it early, again, don't take my word for it. Look at your own experience. All this is backed by science, but look at your own experience. By catching it early, you're catching it before the narrative formed. If you wait, first thing that happens is they create a meaning. That's what's happening over here. The subconscious is suggesting a meaning. The conscious mind is either rejecting or absorbing, and typically it's accepting that meaning, maybe tweaking it. In a bad situation, when a person's being triggered, the conscious mind is taking that reaction and making it the response. Now the response equals the reaction, and that's how you get that internal looping. But you know that the longer you wait, it turns into meaning, then it turns into a narrative, and then once they start defending it, it's like you're cooked. Then what do? You have to wait. Now it's taking long conversations. But if you catch it early, what's coming up for you? They tell you, they're still forming the meaning. Now you can have an interjection of what it really is. No, it's not that. I know it. No, it's this over here. Case closed, right? Solved. So this is what we're talking about by moving up earlier. So in this section, I took the 600 milliseconds and broke it down into 3/10. You have your pre-listening, which is about 1/10 of a second that the brain is always predicting what might happen. And then you have the initial detection, and then the rapid appraisal, and then you get your mobilization. And there are things that you can do to turn it around at these different stages. It's beyond the scope for today. But that's what I mean when I say move upstream. And there's actually actions that we can take at each one of these to make that happen, as well as on the past, because once you get here, you're moving over into the steps 4, 5, 6, and 7. So this is what we're talking about, the 5 levels of personal leadership, expansion. This is the peak, accelerated. Most people don't spend a lot of time here, but when you hear about athletes saying raise the level, this is essentially what they're doing. They're moving up into this area. Now, you can't stay there forever because it's too intense and you get tired, but you can stay there for when you need it. But you can stay in agency. You can stay in agency for long periods of time. You may need a break. The Pomodoro technique, taking a 5-minute break every 25 minutes or so, that will certainly help. But by breathing, by using different things, by anchoring, and the thing you're doing, though, here's the key. You're reducing the amount of time you spend down here, and you're reducing your susceptibility to the kinds of inputs and experiences that cause you to move down here. That's the key. By removing those resistance factors and those negative activators, if you will, by removing them, you're naturally spending more time in stabilized, and the more you're in stabilized, the easier it is to move into agency. So we stop the inputs here, and we increase the amount of inputs taking you to expansion and agency. Why performance breaks down? Time pressure and urgency reduce cognitive bandwidth. So we know this happens, and you feel it. Again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just think about your own experience and think about those around you. Ambiguity increases load and weakens decision clarity. Social threat activates defensive processing. You can see it right away. Somebody attacks a person. I was talking to a guy just yesterday, and he was saying that his he's from New York. I'm from New York, and there's protocols, right? When you grow up, when you navigate the Bronx and Brooklyn and Harlem and Queens, you actually behave slightly differently because each one of those boroughs has its own sort of code. And he's been out in New York for years, as have I, and he was with his wife. He was saying that his wife was like bugging on him because he's looking at this guy like, he's getting agitated, and just, what's going on? That guy's looking at me like I don't like the way he's looking at me. And the point is, that's just maybe a bizarre example, but that social threat activates defensive processing. We've all seen it where somebody says something, maybe somebody cut someone off. You're the passenger in the seat. You see the person get cut off. You know it was an accident. You know the person, they were just in the blind spot, but the driver's freaking out. You may have been in that situation. So again, you get it. You don't have to listen to me talk about it. You have your own experiences. Cognitive overload fragments attention and focus, and this gets back to the decision fatigue and the willpower waning. So performance doesn't fail at execution, it degrades earlier under pressure. The same way if you watch an athlete who can make the free throws, 75% free throw percentage, but when the game's on the line, they can't make 2 free throws in a row. You don't say they forgot how to make free throws, you say they choked. But when it happens with leaders and professionals, we make something up. It's a narrative. It's their personality. Oh, yeah, it's just this. We treat it like it's different. No, if they choke in this situation and they choke in this situation, it's choking. So you don't work on more knowledge. You work on getting stabilized, and getting stabilized very quickly. And so what enables high performance states? Coherence and presence restore access to capability. Lower stress enables neuroplasticity and learning. Cognitive flexibility expands available options. So you see, as you move up to agency and expansion, you have less stress. They say stress is the silent killer, and that's partly because it's impacting us along the way. A very simple thing: when your internal environment is the external environment of your cells. The cells is what makes us perform, right? The cells have 2 configurations. When there's a threat, when the environment is toxic, if you have enough stress, it's creating a toxic environment internally. When you have a toxic environment, the cells go into protective mode. When they're in protective mode, they're not seeking nutrients. They don't exist in both of those modes at the same time. We're the same way. If we're in threat, if we're feeling threatened, we don't have all our capabilities to pursue our goals and dreams. This is why we want to keep moving up. So cognitive flexibility expands available options. When you move your awareness out, when you go back up and you get out of the fight or flight, you have more flexibility. You have more options. Emotional regulation supports deliberate response. We spend a lot of time on emotional modulation. So the difference is that it's all regulation, but there's preventive, and that's what I mean by moving upstream. It's preventive. We're preventing it from happening. Even if you're not truly preventing it, you can't stop a stimulus, but you can prevent the escalation that happens internally. So it's the same way anti-lock brakes. They don't prevent the thing you have to stop for, but they can prevent the tire from skidding. And it's very similar to that, where by moving upstream, you're preventing this escalation happening. So that's one kind of regulation. Then you have the modulation. That's during. So that's still happening in the first 600 milliseconds for the most part, or early in the conscious mind side. That's the modulating part. And so we talk about emotional modulation a lot there. And then you don't have to worry about it because it becomes a habit. Once it becomes habitual, you don't have to deal with it. So a lot of this transition point is when the work is done. But once it becomes habitual, that's why I call it a reset. You're literally resetting your master system. And then regulation is corrective after the fact. So much of emotional intelligence talks about regulation, which is after the fact, because that's what was known when it was developed. Now we know that it's not a mind over there in the network of neurons. It's something that we can train and condition. Why this matters for leaders. In dynamic environments, performance is determined by state and your control of that state. Leaders don't lose knowledge. As I said, they lose access under pressure. Most breakdowns are predictable and preventable. Rapid recovery restores performance before escalation. And when I talk about rapid recovery, I'm talking about rapid recovery in milliseconds, not minutes, not hours. Milliseconds might be a little bit ambitious, but when you condition it, it's naturally happening in milliseconds because your subconscious network of neurons, it processes at that speed. Consistent access creates reliability at scale, and state control determines decision quality, execution, and outcomes. And guess what? When you're able to flow like that, you're going to have less decision fatigue and you're going to have less waning of your willpower because you're not relying on those. You're relying on your conditioning to make it happen. You're not trying to put toothpaste back in the tube. You're squeezing the toothpaste while it's in the right spot, so everything's working fine. The most valuable leadership skill is the ability to recover and regain access in real time, the same way athletes do. And before you think that this is different, consider that neurons activate muscle action. Neurons activate cognitive processing. The neurons behave the same to deep practice. They behave the same to threat. You can look to physical activity and get many clues of what's going on with cognitive processing. The same way athletes can step up, the same way athletes can train themselves to function under pressure. They play games with themselves. They make believe that they've got to make 3 shots in a row to win the game, and the pressure's all on them. They've experienced it so many times in their head that when the pressure's coming from outside, they've already experienced this old news. So this is kind of what I'm saying. The first moments of a situation, this is where performance is decided before conscious thought, before deliberate response. Patterns initiate automatically. So leadership happens in micro moments. Now, I started by talking about moving above the line, and this is what we want. But it's different up here. You have infinite possibilities. And because unfamiliarity is a threat to the subconscious / network of neurons, this lack of familiarity creates stress. And so if we haven't resolved that, guess what? When you're trying to cross this line, this barrier to get up to above that artificial ceiling, you get knocked back down. By who? By yourself. Because you have the cognitive dissonance and the anxiety that's coming in because you're reacting to the unfamiliar. This is why we set it up to have principles. When you live by principles, you know the world is always going to conform. You've heard reversion to the mean. When you're living by principles, the world is always going to conform back around you because it's principles. That's what they are. So even though it's unfamiliar and it's unknown, you don't worry about it. You're following a simple, methodical, and consistent approach, and you're relying on principles. You have your KPIs, so when it gets off track, you know to take action. But most of the time, you're just following your simple, methodical, and consistent. I'll be doing a workshop next week, April 9th, 11:30 to 2:30 Pacific time. And we're going to get into the 7-step reset. We'll go through exercises That's why it's 3 hours. We're literally doing the exercises and taking you through part by part, step by step, so that you have the skills. We don't work on hard stuff. We don't work on the things that are going to trigger you, because that, just like I was using the example of the phobia, that puts you into a situation where you are getting stressed and you have less access to your capabilities. You're moving down into the destabilized and collapsed. What we do is we work on easy things to keep you in the expansion and agency, so you're experiencing it and you learn it. And then you have your notes to go back, and then you start applying it bit by bit to the harder things. Sometimes people jump in and they try to apply it to the harder things right off the bat. That might work if you have somebody coaching you, working with you, going through it. But because they're watching to see your signals and when are you getting stressed. But we want to start easy, and just like a fighter, when they're training a fighter, they start easy and they work their way up bit by bit. You don't jump into because you got to build it's conditioning. It's conditioning. You wouldn't train a dog to sit, and after they sit 3 times in a row, you move them into a crowded room and show everybody how you just trained your dog to sit, because you know they're too stimulated. It's not going to work. So it's the same principle. Check out the workshop. You'll find that through that process, you will learn to do the things that I shared, and you'll see them in real-time action and experience them for yourself. All right. We will see you hopefully next week on Thursday, April 9th. If not, I'll be live again following Friday, as I do most Fridays on LinkedIn. Okay, we'll see you. Welcome to the Dynamic Leadership Executive Leadership Series. In expanding roles in complex environments, one of the most common leadership experiences is this: what worked before doesn't consistently work now. The external work may look similar, but internally something's changed. The stakes are higher, time is compressed, and decisions carry more weight. What many